Hello, I hope everyone is quite well. It's been about 60 days since I produced my last short story, owing to the fact that I had COVID, which knocked me out for about 3 weeks. Anyway, I'm back in the saddle now and raring to go. And I wanted to take a brief moment just to mention that I've got a new short story collection published. It's called Adam's Flaw and Other Stories by Maguire, which is me. It's illustrated by me, of course. There we have. I think that's don't know how well you can see these on the screen. That's a question of paternity. And what do we have? A moment's decision. Anyway, it's available on Amazon, and I hope it may be of interest to some people. And I'm about to read from this book the final short story, which is a light-hearted effort to close the volume. It's called Good Neighbours.
Bob and Andy were never going to get on. Although they lived next door to each other in adjoining semi-detached houses, they were two very different men. To begin with, they were competitive over everything. If Bob had this year's car, Andy soon had next year's. If Andy bought a new lawnmower, the one advertised on TV, Bob had a self-propelling petrol mower next weekend. But the main source of their mutual disdain was the fact that Bob was a follower of Penshire United, which, as half of Penshire knows, is the best football team in, well, Penshire. And Andy was a supporter of Penshire Town, which was, to the other half of Penshire, without its equal. In Penshire, anyway. Things rubbed along between the neighbours for the most part in a stiff silence. But after the unpleasant business of the Derby day, which resulted in a 5-0 win for United, this all came to an end, and the two men ceased all pretence of peaceful coexistence. Conversation was reduced to a few terse and generally offensive epithets between the men, both of whom maintained to their largely disinterested spouses the absolute vanquishment of their opponent. They probably should never have discussed the match. For one thing, the referee had proved himself to have been bribed by United. Nothing was beneath them. Ignoring every foul against Town, every free kick, and at least 14 penalties, which should safely have seen them victorious and through to the county semi-final, had it not been for the ref's egregious bias, that is. Naturally, Andy returned home in a sour mood, one of outrage, but Bob's return via the pub several joyful hours later had put him in such a euphoric mood that he insisted on dancing in the street outside Andy's house, performing a sort of ungainly sailor's hornpipe. It was, with hindsight, perhaps inevitable that Andy should view this as rubbing salt in an open wound, and he went out to remonstrate with his neighbour. He wished to convey to him that it was not quite the ticket to disport oneself in public over such a matter, and in fact his insistence on doing so was likely to result in his requiring medical assistance and in all probability dental work in the near future if he should persist. An altercation broke out in the street, from which both men were separated by other neighbours. This was the incident that put an end to any pretence of cordiality between the two adjoining houses. It didn't end there, unfortunately. Every single action, word, sound, or sight was closely examined by both men for any indication of a slight against the other. The neighbour's cat, scrabbling in the flower border on Bob's side, was, for instance, an obvious attempt at revenge because the better team had won. The better team? Such rubbish Andy had never heard in all his life. Oh, rubbish, is it? Yes, rubbish, he said with insulting emphasis. Says who? Inquired Bob. Says I, Andy assured him. Andy laughed unpleasantly in a way probably designed to cause offence rather than express genuine mirth. This conversation took place over the fence. Otherwise, Andy assured his wife that he would have fetched Bob a biff in the eye. Bob, meanwhile, told his wife he had bested Andy with his quick-wittedness. Whatever the truth of this, it seems Andy was not entirely satisfied with the outcome of their exchange either, because, after due consideration of full 5 minutes' duration, in which he muttered to himself over and over, "Rubbish, is it? Rubbish?" And then at last, "If it's rubbish you want, I can let you have some more," he marched out red-faced, picked up the bin of household waste, and emptied it over the fence. When Bob saw the condition of his garden, not just potato peelings and scraps of leftover dinners, but a whole chicken carcass from the previous Sunday, he promptly emptied his bin over Andy's fence and, for good measure, went about his house collecting additional garbage to deposit there too. He was delighted to discover his daughter's visit the day before had resulted in the deposit of several dirty nappies from her 10-month-old baby. He sniggered to himself as he tossed these over his neighbour's dividing fence. But not for long, because Andy returned the compliment by emptying what appeared to be a month's collection of cat litter trays into Bob's vegetable garden. After a few days of this, the gardens of both households were held by the rest of the close to be a disgrace. When this was pointed out to Andy by another neighbour, and the foolishness of both men trashing each other's gardens, Andy said with something akin to pride, "His is worse than mine." In truth, there was little to judge between them. It was perhaps inevitable that a sort of low-key game of tit-for-tat was engaged hereafter. Bob put a note through Andy's door informing him his lilac tree was so overgrown that it was blocking the light from his window. He would, therefore, be obliged to take remedial action if Andy did not act promptly to remedy this matter himself. Andy's response was to pop the note back through Bob's letterbox with some bad language on it. Naturally, Bob was incensed at this unneighbourly behaviour, and was moved to fire up his chainsaw and lop the offending tree off at fence height. It was swift and decisive action. Andy responded by visiting his solicitor on Monday morning, who sent Bob a letter at number 14, informing him that by law any of the wood cut down by him in the course of the action rightly belonged to Andy, his client, and if he did not return the cuttings, he would be committing an act of theft from his client. Bob responded by chucking all the cuttings and wood, 2 sackfuls of leaves and other debris, a few bricks, 2 tires, and a rusty old bike over the fence. It can easily be appreciated that relations between the two men were at a low ebb and the cause of disquiet in the neighbourhood. There were, of course, those who found the matter amusing, but they were in the minority. One such man, a crabbed and unfortunate character with a permanent silly grin etched on his face, called Colin Beaker, pointed out to Bob that Andy's brother, when he visited, parked in front of Bob's house, which was rightfully Bob's space. "Is it my space?" queried Bob anxiously. "I thought the road was no one's in particular." "It is, mate," said Colin Beaker sorrowfully. "An ancient by-law says you have to leave the front of your house free for parking your horse on. The fine is 12 bushels of wheat." "Is that so?" inquired Bob with interest. "It's the law, mate," said the knowledgeable Colin Beaker. "I wasn't in when he parked there," said Bob thoughtfully. "No, but you might have been," countered Mr. Beaker. "Yes, but I wasn't," said Bob doggedly. "You might have come home, though," persisted Colin Beaker encouragingly, "and needed that space desperately. Supposing your wife was ill? Well, she wasn't, the slow-witted Bob assured him. Yes, but suppose she was, pointed out the scrupulous Mr. Beaker. I suppose so. I wouldn't have it, Mr. Beaker assured him, with a measure of righteous truculence. No, said Bob, resolving to watch out for any such transgressions on his neighbour's part in future. He did, and he noticed that a visitor to Andy's house parked with the nose of his car slightly over what he ascertained to be an invisible line demarking the right to where he had a space allocated for his horse in the road outside their houses. He compressed his lips in annoyance. Later, when the car had gone, Bob went out with a pot of yellow paint, and scrupulously calculating the point of division between the two houses, he painted a line in the street. Andy watched his neighbour from behind a curtain in the upstairs bedroom of his house. His eyes narrowed. "Twerp!" he exclaimed. He took a photo of him, in case it should be needed as evidence in court of unreasonable behaviour. He also resolved to ignore the line. In fact, he insisted that his Uncle Ted, when visiting the house that Sunday, go out and park with the nose of his car over the line. Uncle Ted was disinclined to do this, being a peaceable sort of man. "I don't need to," he protested. "There's plenty of space outside your house." Andy clicked his tongue impatiently and shook his head at the old man's foolishness. "That's not the point, is it?" he reasoned. "There is space outside his house, and how do I know we won't have an unexpected visitor who needs my space?" Uncle Ted failed to comprehend this imperishable logic. "I'm disinclined to do it," he argued. "I know there's bad blood between you and your neighbour, but, well, I don't want to get caught in the middle of it, do I?" It was, of course, very much a rhetorical question Uncle Ted posed, but Andy bundled the elderly gentleman out of the house and insisted that he park in the manner he had indicated to him. Uncle Ted obliged, but most reluctantly, while Andy chuckled to himself softly with a mild glint of insanity in his eyes. 2 hours later, when Uncle Ted and Aunt Joan left the house, they were dismayed to discover all 4 of his tires were flat. The curtains on Bob's house were twitching with mirth. Andy swore loudly and shook his fist in the direction of the trembling curtains of Bob's bedroom window. "Never mind," he consoled Ted. "I'll teach him a lesson. You'll see. He won't get away with this." "Yes, that's all very well for you to say," protested Uncle Ted. "But what about my tires?" "Well, it's like I said. You see the sort of thing I have to deal with every day?" Ted may have, but it seems he had something of a one-track mind, and wouldn't leave off the matter of his tires. "Don't you worry about your tires," Andy assured him. "I'll make him sorry." This seemed of dubious comfort to Uncle Ted, who told his nephew so in no uncertain terms. Andy was becoming impatient with his uncle, who was unable to get beyond the matter of his tires and see the bigger picture here. "Who's going to pay for my tires?" demanded the old man querulously. That seemed a silly sort of question to Andy, and he tapped him on the chest, saying, "Perhaps you'll be more careful where you park your car in future." Andy, ever mindful of the bigger picture, got his revenge on Bob. He bought himself some ear defenders and a heavy metal album by the noted exponents of the genre, Grim Reaper, whose chief claim to fame was that they were the loudest band on the planet, and had garnered no less than 177 noise abatement orders from various local authorities against them. Andy, snickering to himself, then placed the speakers of his music system, which were over 6 feet tall, and which he had bought specially for this occasion, and took 4 men to carry into his house, where they took up most of the living room, facing against the adjoining wall. He then placed his headphones securely over his ears and turned the volume up to 150 decibels. Next door, Bob thought that 4 military jets had landed on the roof of his house, all at the same time. Of course, although it was a difficult night for Bob and his wife, in those wakeful hours his brain was not idle. In the morning he purchased 2 giant speakers of his own from a friend, which he was assured were illegal in most of Western Europe, and were delivered that afternoon on a low loader. He had them placed against and facing the wall, to the surprise of the delivery men, chuckling to himself all the while, his little eyes dancing merrily. He bought a heavy metal album himself, the great rivals to Grim Reaper, the Decibel Dudes, who many will recall caused permanent stone deafness to a 100,000-strong audience of their fans at Glastonbury in 1984. That night, Bob and his wife slept wearing the ear defenders, and in the room next door, beyond the adjoining wall, Andy and his wife lay wearing their ear defenders, while the entirety of their house and themselves trembled all night long. This became the norm for the 2 houses from this point on. There were many cracked windows in both houses, where the frequencies had occasionally coincided with those of particular window panes, leading to their fracturing. Bob had overcome this impediment by taping over his windows with heavy-duty criss-crossed duct tape. Seeing this, Andy had followed suit and went a step further, wrapping china ornaments, glassware, mirrors, and some fine porcelain he had inherited from his great-aunt in duct tape to protect these also. Obviously, amongst those who did not see the bigger picture were many of the rest of the close, who did not enjoy sleeping with ear defenders on while the entire close rumbled all night long to an uneuphonious mix of the Decibel Dudes and Grim Reaper. They resented, too, their having to tape their windows over with duct tape as a precaution. When scientists from the Seismological Institute in Bixborough measured 4.7 on the Richter scale on 4 consecutive nights in Penshire, the local authorities decided to take action. A noise abatement order was imposed, and inspectors with measuring instruments were on hand to enforce the order. Both men were obliged to desist from further playing of their music, although Bob solved the difficulty of the gigantic speakers by breaking them up and tossing them into Andy's backyard. 2 hours later, of course, Andy responded by tossing an old washing machine and tumble dryer over Bob's fence with the assistance of a nephew. Bob had a horrible feeling he had been bested in some way. The washing machine and tumble dryer easily outdid his gigantic speakers, although Andy's wife was not at all happy when she discovered her washing machine was missing. "You can do your own washing," she informed him. Anyway, Bob wasn't going to let the matter rest there, and spent most of the night thinking up a suitable riposte. When he did, he lay there in bed, sniggering to himself in the darkness. He had some shopping to do in the morning. He went to a shop in Bixborough in a state of high excitement, and on his return home his excitement persisted all day. He could hardly wait for the evening. In the early hours, at around 2 a.m., Bob went next door and lit a connected fuse and popped 50 firecrackers through Andy's letterbox. 3 hours later, both men stood surveying the ruins of their houses. The fire was doused to a smoking ruin when the chief fire officer came across to them. Both men were stony silent. "Bad business," he said to them. "I suppose the insurance will cover the loss to your houses?" "I have no insurance," said Bob mournfully. "I spent it on certain items, and I've had a lot of expenses recently." "Same with me," said Andy. "That's too bad," said the fire chief. "What caused it?" inquired Andy. "Kids," he declared. "We've had a few problems with some youths popping firecrackers through letterboxes in the town lately. This is the first time it's led to anything like this, though. Idiotic behaviour." Andy turned to Bob after the fire chief had left to supervise the winding up of the machines. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I have to admit I thought this was your doing when I first saw what had happened." "No apology is necessary," said Bob, not looking at Andy. He had a queasy smile on his face, though. Andy was shaking his head, looking in wonder at the charred remains of their houses. "Idiots," he said meaningfully. Bob looked at his neighbour and then at the smoking ruins. The light was coming up in the east. It would be a sunny day. He found himself agreeing on something with Andy for the first time in a long time. "Yes," he said, "absolute idiots."